Well, good morning. Welcome to our second class in our series on one chapter books. As you can see on the slide, we're starting in Obadiah. This is the second week of Obadiah, and then we'll move to Philemon, 2nd John, 3rd John, and the book of Jude. So today's lesson is Edom's history from Obadiah, verses 10 through 14. And the booklet has divided it up in the following way. Violence against Jacob, verses 10 and 11, disinterest toward Jacob, verses 12 and 13, and then at the crossroads is how Chad Ramsey, the one who works on these booklets for the Gospel Advocate Foundation's Adult Bible Studies, has titled this one verse, Obadiah, verse 14. And really at this point, we find out not only had they been violent against God's people, and not only had they been apathetic, but they also were actively pursuing and holding the Israelites, the house of Jacob, um, to be taken into captivity. And again, depending, as we talked last week about the date of the book, it makes a lot of sense to date this around the time of the Babylonian captivity, although the animosity between Edom and Jacob went on, as we are going to see, from even in the womb. So our introduction today is going to look at another section of the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible. We're going to look at Genesis 25. The children struggled together within her, and she said, "If it is thus, why is this happening to me?" So she went to inquire of the Lord. And the Lord said to her, "Two nations are in your womb, and two peoples from within you shall be divided. The one shall be stronger than the other. The older shall serve the younger." Esau was the firstborn, but Jesus comes through Jacob. The nation was through Jacob. Esau had sold his birthright. He had given up his rights to the inheritance of the oldest. And we see here the older shall serve the younger. I think it's also interesting, just in these first few verses of this introductory text, to notice verse 23, the first part, the very before we get to the poetic nature of what the Lord said, but just the fact the Lord said to her. And we kind of read the Old Testament and we feel like the Lord is talking to people all the time, but really, if you look at the timelines and the space between some of these revelations, and of course we're not given every time the Lord speaks to an individual, I'm sure, but here he's talking to mom and letting her know what's going on. I mean, what a prophetic statement to be told. So very, very neat and very awesome here, I think. When her days to give birth were completed, behold, there were twins in her womb. The first came out red, all his body like a hairy cloak. So they called his name Esau. Afterward, his brother came out with his hand holding Esau's heel. So his name was called Jacob. Isaac was 60 years old when she bore them. When the boys grew up, Esau was a skillful hunter, a man of the field, while Jacob was a quiet man, dwelling in tents. Isaac loved Esau because he ate of his game, but Rebekah loved Jacob. And of course, we know the story of Jacob making stew like Esau would make and tricking his father at Rebekah's bidding. There was just conflict in this family right from the beginning. The parents having favorites, and then Rebekah really going over the top in her promotion of Jacob. But as we read, the Lord prophesied all this. This was not necessarily what God wanted as far as the deception and things like that, but as far as God working human sin and human problems and the fall into his big will, the ultimate will, things happened, of course, the way God putting all those things into the pot, the way in which God wanted them to go. And Jesus comes from the line of Jacob. So the house of Esau, the house of Edom, was constantly at odds with the house of Jacob. And we're going to see that even more clearly this week than last week in our Obadiah text as we look at verses 10 through 14. So first, as we noted, violence against Jacob. Because of the violence done to your brother Jacob, shame shall cover you, and you shall be cut off forever. On the day that you stood aloof, on the day that strangers carried off his wealth, and foreigners entered his gates, and cast lots for Jerusalem, you were like one of them. So there was violence, and already in verse 11, really, we get to the idea of the indifference, but we'll look at that more clearly in verses 12 and 13. But notice what happens when we are violent, or if we are violent in the sense of not stepping in and not doing something about an evil. Shame shall cover you, and you shall be cut off forever. This would be true even today spiritually. Jesus, in one of his judgment narratives, he talks about those who gave him things to drink and things to eat and clothing and came and visited him when he was sick and when he was in prison, and that the people were so confused. I mean, when did we see you in those ways? And when did we do that? And he said, whenever you did it for one of these, my brethren, you did it for me. And the people who end up being cut off, the people who end up being shamed, are the ones who didn't give Jesus a drink when he was thirsty, and give him food when he was hungry, and visit him when he was sick or in prison, give him clothing when he was naked. When we don't do what God wants us to do, it is shameful. We spent all last quarter at our congregation looking at the theme unashamed from the book of Romans. Paul was able to say, I am not ashamed of the gospel. When we are not ashamed of the gospel, when we are not ashamed of God or Christ or the Spirit or their word, then God will not be ashamed of us. It's quite an amazing and deep truth that we have before us in this. But if we do the wrong things, if we are ashamed, then shame will cover us and we'll be cut off. There will be judgment. Obadiah is a great book about judgment, a great book about God in the end doing what needs to be done. In the end, for the Edomites, from our perspective, from a spiritual perspective, maybe we're looking at the end of all times when Jesus comes back again and the judgment takes place. And we should use verse 11 to lead into 12 and 13, this idea of disinterest or apathy or disengagement to help. On that day you stood aloof, on the day that strangers carried off his wealth, and foreigners entered his gates. They cast lots for Jerusalem. You were like one of them. And it's because that they just stood off in the distance watching. And we're going to see that even more here in verses 12 and 13. Disinterest toward Jacob. So notice the do nots here. Do not gloat over the day of your brother in the day of his misfortune. Do not rejoice over the people of Judah in the day of their ruin. Do not boast in the day of distress. Our culture these days is very much into people failing, very much enjoying the idea of people being less fortunate than them, people having struggles. We even have whole TV series about these kinds of things. We're not supposed to gloat. We're not supposed to rejoice. We're not supposed to boast. We shouldn't look at someone else's distress and feel good about it. We should not be rejoicing when other people have been destroyed or they're in a misfortunate situation. And we have to add here Judah did this to himself. The nation did this. The reason God allowed them to be taken into Babylonian captivity, the reason in the book of Judges that people kept overtaking God's people, it was because of their lack of faith. It was because of their sin, particularly their idolatry. And so we can't say, well, if someone does it to themselves, we don't have to care. No, everything in the Bible would point the other direction. Judah did this to themselves, but it was still wrong for Edom, for Esau, and his people to gloat and rejoice and boast. They were gloating, they were rejoicing, and they were boasting. Love does not rejoice at wrongdoing, but rejoices with the truth. If Edom would have loved Jacob, if the Edomites would have loved God's people, God's chosen ones, they're brothers. They're still linked by Jacob and Esau. They would not have rejoiced at this. We must not rejoice at wrongdoing or these other things listed in the Obadiah text. Misfortune, ruin, distress. We must not rejoice at these things. We rejoice with the truth if we are in Christ Jesus. So do not gloat, do not rejoice, and then, as we've already read, do not boast. And from 1 Corinthians 13, once again, love doesn't boast. Love doesn't do that. If we're full of love, we are going to be patient and kind. We're not going to envy or boast. We're not going to be arrogant or rude. We're not going to do the things that the Edomites were doing. And then verse 13, do not enter the gate of my people in the day of their calamity. Do not gloat over his disaster in the day of his calamity. Do not loot his wealth in the day of his calamity. Now remember verse 11 that we used to kind of lead into this idea of disinterest. The Edomites were just watching as others entered the gates, as the disaster was happening, as they were casting lots for the wealth. And it said in verse 11, you are like one of them. You are the same. So God can prophesy and state through Obadiah, do not enter the gate, do not gloat, do not loot, because that's, even though they weren't there in person, that's what they were doing. And notice in the day of their calamity, over and over again here, the day of their calamity, the day of his calamity, the day of his calamity. When people are down and out, we must not take advantage of them. We must not rejoice in that. Jesus is our perfect example of how to behave when people are down and out, when people are struggling, because he reached out to all of them. When John the Baptist sent his followers to Jesus to find out, are you really the one? Jesus sent them back. And he didn't just say yes. He talked about the down and out. He said, you know what? The lame are walking, the blind are seeing, the deaf are hearing, and the gospel's being preached to the poor. We must never take advantage of the down and out. We must be sharing with them the good news of Jesus Christ. And then the final verse of our text for today, at the crossroads, the Edomites were just so despicable as they watched their adversaries, their, the brother that they never got along with, so to speak, but they were despicable as they watched what was happening to the people of Jacob, God's people. Do not stand at the crossroads to cut off his fugitives. People were running, and they would stop them. Do not hand over his survivors in the day of distress. They would actually hand these people over to, in all likelihood, the Babylonians. And then our booklet, and right from the introduction, we talked about that the booklet is assuming that Obadiah is written around the time of the Babylonian captivity. And so the booklet references 2 Kings 25, 4 through 7. And this is paralleled. It's not exact wording, but the same exact narrative, the same exact story in Jeremiah 39, 4 through 7, and Jeremiah 52, 7 through 11. It is repeated again. So what we find out here in 2 Kings, then a breach was made in the city, and all the men of war fled by night by the way of the gate between the two walls, by the king's garden. And the Chaldeans were around the city, and they went in the direction of the Arabah. But the army of the Chaldeans pursued the king and overtook him in the plains of Jericho. And that would have been down south toward Edom. Again, at the crossroads is what's assumed here. And the Edomites keeping the fleers from continuing on and taking refuge. And all his army was scattered from him. Then they captured the king and brought him up to the king of Babylon at Riblah, and they passed sentence on him. They slaughtered the sons of Zedekiah before his eyes and put out the eyes of Zedekiah and bound him in chains and took him to Babylon. Just absolutely despicable stuff. But the Edomites played a hand in it. Do not stand at the crossroads to cut off his fugitives. Do not hand over his survivors in the day of distress. For us, we must be willing. And again, I'm going to take the text here, the idea of the crossroads, and pull that word kind of out here. But if someone's in distress, if someone is fleeing for their life spiritually in our day, we must help them. We cannot hurt them. We cannot stand at the crossroads and not care. We must share Jesus and help people who are in distress. And I'll tell you, in our culture right now, we have a lot of people in distress. That's for sure. So, application 1, Christians cannot remain neutral when truth is under attack. We must, as Peter reminded his audience, always be ready to give a defense to everyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you, with meekness and fear. Of course, this must be done in an appropriate way. We must always speak the truth in love. And I was intrigued by the Proverbs passage. It talks, and I've got verses 1 through 7 instead of just verse 2 for us this morning. And so many times it mentions the tongue or the mouth or what we need to be speaking about. I think at least 3 times in these 7 verses. So really, really kind of neat. And by extension, many more, the whole section. So Proverbs 15, 1 through 7, a soft answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. The tongue of the wise commends knowledge, but the mouths of fools pour out folly. The eyes of the Lord are in every place, keeping watch on the evil and the good. A gentle tongue is a tree of life, but perverseness in it breaks the spirit. A fool despises his father's instruction, but whoever heeds reproof is prudent. In the house of the righteous there is much treasure, but trouble befalls the income of the wicked. The lips of the wise spread knowledge. Not so the hearts of fools. Let's be prepared to give an answer for our hope, and let's speak the truth in love. Application 2, Christians cannot remain neutral either when brethren stand in need. If we can help and have the opportunity, we have a responsibility. Paul told the Galatians, therefore, as we have opportunity, let us do good to all, especially to those who are of the household of faith. Those who refuse to help their brethren fail to demonstrate the love of God. I was thinking about the Galatians 6 passage as I was reading our main text before I even read the applications, and was thinking, boy, this is exactly what that Galatians passage is talking about. The Edomites, we're supposed to be helping people, but especially our brethren, especially people who are of the household of faith. The Edomites should have been helping whoever they could help in an ideal world, but especially those of the house of Jacob. And then this lesson has 3 applications. So here we go. Application 3. We must guard against the sin of greed and covetousness. The Edomites not only failed to help the people of Judah, but also took advantage of their downfall. The greedy way they scoured Jerusalem after its destruction demonstrates what they valued. Jesus warned against such behavior. He declared, "Take heed and beware of covetousness, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of the things he possesses." Luke 12:15. So really great things for us to think about, great things for us to pray that our hearts will not fall into. Or if we tend to be some of the ways the Edomites were, praying to God for help in becoming better, in being sanctified, in being moved toward a more godly position. We have some discussion questions once again, and I will read these out. And this is a place you could pause in the video and think about these things and contemplate them, and even look at some scriptures concerning them, or spend some time in prayer concerning these things. So number 1, what do you think is the main lesson we can learn from this text? And this might be different for different people, but what's the main thing you personally can learn from this text? How can we make sure we stay involved in the lives of our brethren? So how can we make sure we are especially taking care of the household of faith? What can we do to combat the temptation to be greedy? Great contemplation for us. And finally, number 4, what does this passage teach us about God's expectations for his people? Another great question from the booklet. Well, next week we will be looking at the end of Obadiah. Obadiah just having these 21 verses. On December 18th, we will be looking at verses 15 through 21, the day of the Lord. And may the Lord continue to bless us as we study his word.